In the year 1015, a Norse ruler made it a crime to be a berserker, not to murder anyone, simply to go berserk. The punishment was exile, and if you stood by and did not tie the man down, you were exiled too. The most feared warriors of the Viking Age were eventually treated by their own people as a public menace, written out of the law books and out of respectable society, and almost everything you have been told about why they fought the way they did, the mushrooms, the wolf skins, the madness, starts to come apart the moment you handle the evidence yourself. So handle it with me. By the end of this, you will know what a berserker actually was, what he almost certainly was not, and why the people who lived beside him decided they had finally had enough of him. Start where every story about berserkers starts, with a single paragraph written by an Icelander named Snorri Sturluson sometime in the early 13th century. In the Ynglinga saga, describing the followers of Odin, Snorri writes that they rushed forward without armour, that they were as mad as dogs or wolves, that they bit their shields and were as strong as bears or bulls, that they cut men down at a single blow, and that neither fire nor iron could touch them. He even gives the condition a name, berserk's ganga, going berserk. That paragraph is the source of every berserker you have ever seen on a screen, and the first thing to know is that Snorri was not a witness. He was writing roughly 200 years after the last berserkers had been driven out of Icelandic law, about a pagan past that had already turned into legend by the time he picked up his pen. Asking Snorri what a berserker was like is a little like asking someone alive today to describe a duel from personal memory. So go earlier. The oldest surviving mention of these men is not a saga at all. It is a poem, the Haraldsskvedi, also called Hrafnsmal, attributed to a skald named Thorbjorn Hornklofi, and generally dated to the late 9th or early 10th century, close enough to touch. In it, a raven describes King Harald Fairhair's warriors at the sea battle of Hafrsfjord. The berserks roared, the poem says, the wolfskins howled and shook their iron spears. That line matters for two separate reasons. First, it means berserkers were not simply invented by later storytellers, because men who were alive at the time already knew the word. Second, notice who they are standing next to. The wolfskins, the Ulfhednar, another band of animal-named fighters who turn up in the same breath, doing the same job. Which brings you to the word itself, and to an argument that has been running for 2 centuries. Berserker splits into 2 pieces, serk, a shirt or a coat, and ber, which can be read 2 ways. Snorri read it as bear, a man who fought without armour, bare-shirted. Most scholars now lean the other way, toward Bjorn, bear, bare-shirt, a man wearing a bear's skin. And that reading fits the Ulfhednar perfectly, wolf coats beside bear coats, warriors named for the animal they put on. There is even a picture on the Swedish island of Öland at Torslunda. Archaeologists found small bronze dies from the 6th century, used for stamping decoration onto helmets. One of them shows a figure wrapped in a wolf pelt, the wolf's head pulled up over his own, a spear in his hand, walking beside a one-eyed man. Whatever else these fighters were, they were people who deliberately wore an animal and who wanted everyone to see it. That is the key that unlocks the whole subject. Berserkers were not in origin men with a medical condition. They were men in a costume that carried meaning, a brotherhood, a cult of the bear and the wolf, almost certainly tied to Odin, who was the god of poetry and of fury in equal measure. The word for their state is built like the name of a ritual, not a diagnosis, and in the earliest sources they are not lone lunatics roaming the woods at all. They are the king's men. Harald Fairhair keeps them. They stand on the ship's prow, in the most exposed place in a sea battle, precisely because that is where you put the men who have made a public promise not to flinch. And they came in groups. Over and over in the poems and the sagas, berserkers turn up as a band, very often a band of 12, a number that repeats so insistently it looks less like coincidence than like the size of a unit. These were not solitary madmen wandering out of the forest. They were organised, named, retained and useful, which is why a king kept them, and why a poet at his court praised them in front of the whole hall. Which raises the obvious question, the one that probably brought you here. How does a man actually do that? How do you stand at the front of a shield wall, hearing what you are hearing, and not run? For about 240 years, the most popular answer in the English-speaking world has been a mushroom. And here is the twist that this entire subject turns on. The most famous explanation is very probably the worst one. The mushroom in question is the fly agaric, Amanita muscaria, the storybook toadstool, scarlet with white flecks. The idea that Vikings ate it to go berserk did not come from a Viking. It came from a Swedish theologian and naturalist named Samuel Odin, and he published it in 1784, roughly 700 years after the last berserkers vanished from Scandinavia. Odin had never seen a berserker. What he had read were travellers' reports about Siberian shamans using fly agaric, and he reasoned by simple analogy: wild northern people, wild northern mushroom, wild northern behaviour. That was the entire evidence. A guess made in a study in the 18th century, dressed up as history, repeated so often that it hardened into a fact. Two things went wrong with it, and both are serious. The first is that no source from the Viking Age, or anywhere near it, mentions berserkers eating anything at all before a fight. Not the poems, not the sagas, not the laws, not one hostile foreign chronicler, all of them delighted to record anything strange about the Norse. The silence is total. The second problem is chemistry. Fly agaric's main active compound is mucimol, and mucimol is a sedative. It works on the brain's brakes, not its accelerator. It brings confusion, dizziness, nausea, loss of coordination, and very often sleep. A man who has just eaten fly agaric is not a weapon. He is a liability who badly needs to lie down. He is not the man you would put on the prow of your ship. So the single most repeated fact about berserkers is a 200-year-old guess that contradicts both the sources and the pharmacology, which does not mean nobody has proposed a better candidate. In 1956, an American neurologist named Howard Fabing published a paper in the Scientific Monthly under a title you would never get past a journal today, on Going Berserk, a neurochemical inquiry. Fabing suspected the answer might be bufotenine, a compound found in toads and in certain plants, and he tested it the way things were tested then, by injecting it into inmates at the Ohio State Penitentiary and writing down what happened. Their faces turned purple, they felt tightness in the chest and throat, and none of them turned into anything resembling an invincible warrior. As science, it is remembered mainly as a warning. As history, it did one useful thing: it opened the door to a better question. Not what did Siberians take, but what actually grew in northern Europe. The strongest candidate to walk through that door is black henbane, Hyoscyamus niger. It is a weed that grows across Scandinavia, and it has been in the human medicine chest since the Stone Age. Its alkaloids, hyoscyamin and scopolamin, do very nearly the opposite of the mushroom. They can lift the heart rate, widen the pupils, dull the sense of pain, cloud the memory, and, at the wrong dose, produce agitation and a delirium in which a person may thrash and rage, and afterwards recall almost nothing of it. In 2019, an ethnobotanist named Karsten Fatu set this out in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology, arguing that henbane fits the described berserker state far better than fly agaric ever did. Read the two symptom lists side by side, and it is genuinely hard to disagree, and there is a real find in the ground. At Fyrkat, one of Harald Bluetooth's great ring fortresses in Denmark, excavators uncovered a grave from around the end of the 10th century holding a woman buried with extraordinary care. Fine clothes shot through with gold thread, a wagon body for a coffin, an iron staff with bronze fittings, and in a small pouch hundreds of henbane seeds. That is real Viking Age henbane, in a real Viking Age grave. But be honest about what it proves, because this is exactly where popular history quietly cheats. That grave is not a berserker's. Everything about it, the staff, the seeds, the ritual wealth, points to a vulva, a seeress, a woman whose work was prophecy and magic, rather than the shield wall. It proves that the Norse had henbane, and knew perfectly well what it did to a person. It does not put henbane into a warrior's hand. Fator himself called his paper speculative, and he was right to. There is no berserker grave with a pouch of seeds. There is no text. There is a good chemical fit and an open question, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. Which leaves the least glamorous explanation, and very probably the best one, that nobody needed a drug at all. Your body already makes one. Fear at the right pitch floods you with adrenaline and noradrenaline. Your pupils widen, your heart hammers, blood leaves your skin and goes to the big muscles. Pain stops registering, time stretches and warps, and your hearing narrows to a tunnel. Soldiers describe it. Crash survivors describe it. Researchers call it battle trance, and the people who come out of it report almost exactly what the sagas report. That they felt nothing, that they remember very little, that they were, for a few minutes, startlingly strong. Now add ritual. Imagine reaching that state deliberately. The drumming, the chanting, the animal skin across your shoulders, the god's name, the bitten shield rim, and remember that biting the shield is precisely what a jaw does when a body is drowning in adrenaline and has nowhere to put it. You do not need a mushroom to build any of that. You need belief, a group of men, and a rhythm. And here is the detail that persuades me more than any other, because it is the one no storyteller would ever bother to invent. The sagas say that once the fury passed, the berserker was left weak, feeble, tame, useless, sometimes for a day. That is not a heroic flourish. It is a bad look for a legend. But it is exactly, precisely what adrenaline does. The surge is alone, and the body always comes to collect. A 13th century Icelander describing a comedown he had no chemistry to explain, purely because that is what the old accounts insisted, is a small quiet mark of authenticity in an otherwise very unreliable text, and you already know that feeling at a much smaller scale. The near miss on the road, when the car finally stops and you realize you had already braked and swerved before you had decided anything. That strange floating calm while it is happening, and then the shaking afterwards, when you sit down and your hands will not behave, and you feel hollowed out for the rest of the afternoon. Multiply that by a lifetime of training, a brotherhood watching, and a religion that told you the fury was a gift handed down from a god, and you are most of the way to a berserker without a single mushroom. So who were these men when nobody was fighting? This is the part the films never show you, and it is the part this channel exists for. For most of the year, a berserker lived the same life as everyone around him. A farm, animals, a roof to keep on, a winter to survive. Fighting was seasonal work, like the harvest. The lucky ones were retained. A lord fed them, gave them silver and drink and a place at his table, and in exchange they stood exactly where he told them to stand. That is a job, not a curse. The unlucky ones were something else entirely. When a warband broke up, or a king died, you were left with men whose only trade was violence, with no land, no lord, and a fearsome reputation as their single remaining asset. You can watch what happened next in the sagas if you read them as social documents rather than adventure stories. There was a legal custom called the holmgang, a formal duel on an island or in a marked-out square, meant to settle disputes without dragging whole families into a feud. A man with a reputation could turn that custom into a weapon. In Egil's saga, a berserker called Ljot the Pale arrives demanding another man's sister in marriage, and land along with her, and challenges her brother to a duel the poor man cannot possibly survive. That is not heroism, that is a protection racket with legal paperwork, and the saga treats Ljot as exactly what he is, a problem to be removed, which Egil duly does. Read enough sagas and the pattern is impossible to miss. The berserker is a stock character, and the role he is given, again and again, is the villain. He arrives, he threatens a household, he demands a daughter or a farm, and the hero deals with him. Snorri's shield-biting supermen are the distant memory of the thing. The berserker of the family sagas is the neighbourhood menace who ruins somebody's harvest. There is another kind too, and he is stranger and much sadder. Egil's saga describes his own grandfather, a man called Kveld Ulf, Evening Wolf, who was said to be Hamrammer, shape-strong, a capable, level-headed man through the day, who grew dangerous and somehow other as the light went, and then sat drained afterwards. Whatever that actually describes, a temper, an illness, a reputation the family was frightened of, a story told about a difficult man by relatives who nevertheless loved him. It is not a superpower. It is something a household had to live around and quietly work to contain. Which brings us back to where we started, and to the hardest evidence in this entire subject. Not a poem, not a saga, a law. Around 1015, Jarl Erik Håkonarson of Norway outlawed berserkers. Outlawed them, the very same kind of men a court poet had praised on Harald's ships a century earlier. And in Iceland, the Christian laws section of the code we call Gragas makes it flatly criminal. If a man goes berserk, the penalty is lesser outlawry, 3 years banishment from the country, and the men standing nearby are banished too if they fail to bind him. Sit with that second clause for a moment, because it is the most human line in this whole story. The law does not describe glory, it describes an emergency. It assumes a man may fall into this state in front of witnesses, and it tells those witnesses precisely what to do about it. Get hold of him, tie him up. That is not a rule written about a war hero, that is a rule written about somebody's cousin at a feast. Communities do not legislate against things that are rare and admirable. They legislate against the thing that keeps happening and keeps costing them. So what was a berserker? Honestly, we do not know, and anyone who uses the word definitely has already left the evidence behind. Not the mushroom, which is a guess from 1784 that the chemistry refuses to support. Not henbane, which fits well and remains entirely unproven. Not a tidy diagnosis either, because the word covered a cult, a costume, a career, and a state of mind all at once, and probably a different mixture of those in every generation. Certainly not a horned helmet, no Viking ever wore one into battle, that came from a 19th century opera costume department, along with a great deal else you think you know, and not the armoured giant from the games and the television series either. Those are our myths, made by us, about them. What survives, once the fog burns off, is smaller and far more interesting than any of it. Some young men put on a bear's skin and stood at the front of a ship because a god, a king, and their friends were all watching. Their own bodies did the rest, the way bodies do. And then, across a few generations, the people who had to live beside them, the farmers, the wives, the lawmakers, the ones left to clean up after the feast, quietly decided that a man who could not stop was not a hero at all, so they wrote him out of the law, which may be the most Norse fact in this entire story. The Vikings, the people we remember as the wildest in Europe, looked at their own wildest men and voted to tie them up.